The plantation records tell a story that Charleston authorities tried to bury for over a century. Starting in 1843, 17 children were born in the slave quarters of Southern Carolina plantations, children with skin as pale as cotton and eyes the color of coastal waters. By 1851, every single one of them had disappeared from the slave registries. No death certificates, no sale records, no trace. What the official documents don't mention is far more disturbing. These children weren't freed, and they weren't killed. They were transformed, given new names, new histories, new families, and sold into white society for prices that would make a plantation owner's annual profit look modest. The transactions were handled by men whose names still appear on courthouse walls and street signs across South Carolina. And the process that made it possible involved a network so carefully constructed that families on both sides, black and white, kept the secret for generations, knowing that one word could destroy everything. Before we continue with the story of Fair Hope Plantation and the children who vanished from its quarters, take a moment to subscribe to Circle of Fear. We bring you the darkest corners of American history. Stories that were deliberately forgotten. Stories that challenge everything we thought we knew. And after you hear what happened in the Carolina Low Country, leave a comment telling us what state or city you're listening from. Are there secrets buried in your hometown? The truth of what happened begins not with the children themselves, but with the silence that surrounded them from the moment they drew their first breath. Fair Hope Plantation sat 23 miles northwest of Charleston, positioned where the Ashley River curved through marshland thick with cypress and live oak. The main house, a two-story structure with double galleries and 6 white columns, overlooked 300 acres of rice fields that had made the Colson family wealthy enough to own 47 enslaved people by 1842. The plantation had operated for 61 years without incident, known throughout the region for its efficient production and, according to whispered conversations in Charleston, drawing rooms for the discretion of its master. Thomas Colson had inherited Fair Hope at age 29 when his father died of yellow fever. Unlike many plantation owners who preferred to live in Charleston and visit their properties only during planting and harvest, Thomas resided at Fair Hope year-round. His wife had died giving birth to their only child, a daughter named Margaret, who was sent to live with relatives in Virginia when she was 7. Thomas never remarried. Neighbors considered him melancholic but fair, a man who kept to himself and ran his plantation with quiet efficiency. His overseer, a man named Duncan Hayes, had worked at Fair Hope for 18 years and shared his employer's preference for order over brutality, not out of kindness, but because a stable workforce produced better yields. The slave quarters at Fair Hope consisted of 14 cabins arranged in 2 facing rows, each structure housing between 3 and 5 people, depending on family size. The cabins were built of tabby, a mixture of oyster shells, lime, sand, and water that kept them cool in summer and relatively warm in winter. The quarters were cleaner than most, another mark of Thomas Colson's obsession with efficiency. Sickness meant lost labor, so rations were adequate and living conditions were maintained just above the level of misery. Among the enslaved community, there lived a woman named Rena, 24 years old in the summer of 1843, who worked in the main house as a seamstress and occasional personal servant when guests visited. She had been born at Fair Hope, as had her mother and grandmother before her. Rhea possessed what was often called good features in the coded language of the time: lighter skin than many of the field workers, hazel eyes and hair that fell in loose waves rather than tight curls. Her grandmother had been purchased from a family in Barbados, bringing with her a mixed heritage that had been passed down through 3 generations. Rhea could read, taught in secret by an elderly white woman who had briefly worked as a tutor at Fair Hope before her death, though she kept this skill carefully hidden, knowing the danger it represented. In the spring of 1843, Raina became pregnant. She never spoke about the father, not to her mother, not to the other women in the quarters, not even to Ruth, who had been her closest friend since childhood. When asked, she would turn away and continue whatever task occupied her hands. The other enslaved women understood what her silence meant. They had seen it before, that particular shame mixed with rage that came from violations that couldn't be discussed, because there was no justice available, no authority to appeal to, no way to name what had happened without making everything worse. Thomas Coulson made no acknowledgement of Raina's condition. She continued working in the main house until her 7th month, when Duncan Hayes reassigned her to lighter tasks in the quarters. The pregnancy proceeded normally, and in December 1843, Raina gave birth to a daughter. The midwife who attended the birth, a woman named Diana, who had delivered 43 children at Fair Hope over the course of 20 years, later told her husband that she had nearly cried out when she first saw the infant. The child's skin was pale, not the light brown of a mixed-race baby, but pale enough to be mistaken for white in certain light. Her eyes, when they opened 2 days later, were distinctly blue. Raina named her daughter Lily, and for the first 3 months of the child's life, she kept her hidden as much as possible, claiming the baby was sickly and needed to stay indoors. But secrets were impossible to maintain in the close confines of the quarters, and word spread quickly about Lily's unusual appearance. The other enslaved people reacted with a mixture of fascination and fear. Some of the older women whispered that the child was marked, that she would bring trouble. Others saw in Lily's features a stark reminder of the violence and coercion that had shaped their lives for generations. Thomas Coulson first saw Lily in March 1844, when Raina brought the infant to the main house because she had no one to mind the child during the day. He studied the baby for a long moment, his face revealing nothing, then told Raina to continue her work. He said nothing about Lily's appearance. He asked no questions. That night, he sent for Duncan Hayes, and the two men met in Thomas's study until well past midnight. 3 weeks later, a man arrived at Fair Hope Plantation who introduced himself as Samuel Porter, a textile merchant from Columbia. He spent 2 days at the plantation, ostensibly discussing business with Thomas Coulson, though no shipments of fabric arrived, and no orders were placed. Samuel Porter was seen walking through the quarters one morning, accompanied by Duncan Hayes, nodding and taking notes in a small leather journal. He looked at the children, all of them, with an attention that made their mothers uneasy. Before he left, Samuel Porter spent an hour alone with Thomas Coulson in the study. When he departed, he carried with him a sealed envelope and a promise that they would correspond regularly. Lily was 6 months old when she disappeared. It happened in June 1844, during a stretch of weather so hot and still that even the insects seemed to move slowly through the thick air. Raina had risen before dawn, as she always did, to feed Lily before beginning her work in the main house. She nursed the baby, changed her clothes, and laid her in the wooden cradle that had been used for 3 generations of enslaved children. Ruth had promised to check on Lily throughout the day, as she often did when Raina was working. At mid-morning, Ruth went to Raina's cabin to find it empty. The cradle was there, the blanket still warm, but Lily was gone. Ruth checked with the other women, thinking perhaps someone had taken the baby outside for air, but no one had seen her. A cold panic began to spread through the quarters. The kind of fear that came not from mystery, but from terrible understanding. Ruth ran to the main house and found Raina in the sewing room. The words spilled out. Lily was gone. The cabin was empty. No one had seen anything. Rhea dropped the shirt she had been mending and ran, her heart pounding so hard she thought it would break through her chest. By the time she reached the quarters, 7 women were searching, calling Lily's name, checking every cabin, every shed, every shadowed space where an infant might have been placed. Duncan Hayes appeared within 20 minutes, summoned by one of the house servants. He organized a methodical search of the entire plantation, the fields, the rice barns, the processing buildings, the woods that bordered the property. Field workers were pulled from their labor to search. The search continued until nightfall. Lily was not found. Thomas Coulson spoke to Rayna once briefly in the early evening. He stood on the back steps of the main house while she stood in the yard below, her face streaked with tears and dirt. He suggested that perhaps an animal had gotten into the cabin. There were foxes in the area and alligators in the marshes. He said these things in the same tone. He used to discuss crop yields and supply orders, his face expressionless, his hands clasped behind his back. Rhea knew her daughter had not been taken by an animal. There were no signs of struggle, no blood, no torn fabric. Lily had been lifted from her cradle and carried away by human hands. And Rayna knew with a certainty that lived somewhere beneath conscious thought that those hands had been directed by Thomas Coulson. She said nothing. Oh, could she say? Who would she tell? Whose authority would care about an enslaved woman's missing child? So she stood in the yard and listened to Thomas Coulson's hollow assurances, and when he dismissed her, she walked back to her cabin and closed the door. For 3 days, Rayna barely moved. She lay on her narrow bed and stared at the empty cradle, her body still producing milk that had nowhere to go, her arms aching with emptiness. The other women brought her food she didn't eat and water she barely drank. They sat with her in silence because there were no words for this particular grief. On the 4th day, Rayna rose before dawn, washed herself in cold water from the barrel outside her cabin, and returned to work in the main house. Duncan Hayes, surprised to see her, asked if she was fit for labor. She told him she was. She picked up her needle and thread and began mending a torn seam in one of Thomas Coulson's shirts, her hands moving with mechanical precision. She never spoke Lily's name again. Not to Ruth, not to her mother, not even to herself, in the privacy of her thoughts. It was as if the child had been erased, not just from the plantation, but from existence itself. But Lily had not been erased. She had been transformed. 200 m away, in a well-appointed home on a Trean Street in Columbia, a woman named Charlotte Brennan welcomed a new addition to her family. Charlotte and her husband, Robert, a lawyer who specialized in property disputes, had been unable to have children, a source of quiet sorrow in their 10-year marriage. They had explored various options, including adoption, but the legal complexities and social stigma had proven difficult to navigate. Then Samuel Porter, Robert's cousin and business associate, had approached them with an unusual proposition. He knew of a child, an infant girl recently orphaned, who needed a home. The circumstances were delicate, Samuel explained, and required absolute discretion. The child's parentage was complicated, but she was healthy, beautiful, and available for a price that would cover all legal arrangements and ensure complete confidentiality. Charlotte and Robert asked few questions. The social world they inhabited was built on carefully maintained fictions, and they understood how to accept a convenient story without examining its foundations too closely. They agreed to Samuel's terms, and 3 weeks later, a carriage arrived at their home, carrying a 6-month-old girl with pale skin and blue eyes. They named her Sarah, claimed she was the orphan daughter of Robert's late brother from a marriage that had been kept private due to family complications, and registered her birth with a date and location that had been carefully falsified. A sympathetic clerk in the records office compensated generously for his cooperation, filed the documents without question. Sarah Brennan became, in every legal and social sense, a white child born to a white family. The transaction that had made this possible was never recorded in any official document. The money that had changed hands left no paper trail, and Lily, the enslaved infant who had been born to Raina in the quarters of Fairhope Plantation, ceased to exist in any record that could be traced. She was the first, but she would not be the last. Over the next 7 years, 16 more children were born in the slave quarters of 5 different plantations scattered across the South Carolina Low Country. The plantations were not neighbors. No, they ranged from Beaufort County to Georgetown, distances of 60 miles or more between them, but they shared certain characteristics. Each was prosperous and well-established. Each was owned by families with connections to Charleston's merchant and legal communities. Each employed the same lawyer to handle property transactions, Robert Brennan. The children, like Lily, were born with skin pale enough to pass for white and eyes that ranged from blue to green to hazel. Their mothers, without exception, were light-skinned enslaved women who worked in or near the main houses of their respective plantations. And, like Lily, each child disappeared within the first year of life, vanishing from the quarters with no explanation, no record, and no trace. The pattern was not immediately obvious because the plantations were separate, and the enslaved communities had no way to communicate across those distances. A mother losing a child in Beaufort had no way to know that another mother in Georgetown had experienced the same disappearance 3 months earlier. The grief was isolated, contained within individual plantations, unable to spread or connect or form a larger picture. But Duncan Hayes knew. As overseer of Fairhope Plantation, he had witnessed Lily's disappearance and understood its true nature. And over the following years, as he occasionally traveled to other plantations on business for Thomas Coulson, delivering messages, collecting debts, negotiating sales of rice and timber, he heard whispered stories that matched what had happened to Raina's child. Infant gone missing in the night, a distraught mother given no answers, a white visitor to the plantation shortly before the disappearance. Hayes kept careful notes in a personal journal he hid beneath a floorboard in his quarters. He was not moved by moral outrage. Sasapatriza, he had spent 23 years overseeing enslaved labor and had long since made peace with the brutalities required by that position. His interest was simpler. He believed he was witnessing something unprecedented, and his instinct for self-preservation told him that documenting it might someday prove valuable. By 1849, his journal contained descriptions of 9 disappearances, including dates, plantation names, and physical descriptions of the missing children. He had also noted the repeated presence of certain names: Samuel Porter, Robert Brennan, and a doctor named Horace Strickland, who appeared to facilitate some aspect of the transactions, though Hayes had not yet determined exactly what role the doctor played. In December 1849, a 10th child was born at Fairhope Plantation. The mother was a woman named Catherine, who worked in the kitchen and had never been permitted to speak about the circumstances of her pregnancy. The child, a boy, had the same pale skin and blue eyes that had marked Lily 5 years earlier. Catherine named him Joseph, and she understood immediately what his appearance meant. She had heard the whispered stories about Raina's daughter. Though Rhea had never spoken of Lily again, Ruth had told the story to others, and it had circulated through the quarters in the careful coded way that dangerous information traveled. Catherine knew that Joseph would disappear, and she knew there was nothing she could do to prevent it. But unlike Raina, Catherine decided she would not suffer in silence. 2 weeks before Joseph disappeared, Catherine sought out Duncan Hayes. She found him in the evening near the rice barns, and she did something that could have gotten her whipped or worse. She spoke to him directly without being addressed, and she made a demand. She told Hayes that she knew what was going to happen to her son. She told him that she knew he was part of it, that he kept records, that he had knowledge of where the children went. And she told him that if Joseph was taken, she wanted proof, some object, some token, something that belonged to her son that could be returned to her as evidence that he lived. She didn't ask for her son back. She understood that was impossible. She asked only for proof that he existed somewhere beyond her reach. Hayes stared at her for a long moment. No enslaved person had ever spoken to him with such directness. The reasonable response would have been to have her punished, to reassert the absolute authority that the system demanded. Instead, he nodded once, turned, and walked away. 3 weeks later, Joseph disappeared from his cradle in the same manner that Lily had vanished 5 years earlier. Catherine made no outcry. She did not search or weep or collapse. She returned to her work in the kitchen and said nothing to anyone. A week after Joseph's disappearance, Catherine found a small wooden button on the floor of her cabin near the doorway. It was carved from pale wood and was far too fine to belong to any garment worn by enslaved people. She recognized it immediately because she had sewn it onto the small shirt she had made for Joseph using fabric scraps she had saved from the main house. Catherine placed the button in a small cloth pouch and hid it in a crevice in the tabby wall of her cabin. It was not the child, but it was proof. Joseph had existed. He had been taken, but he had lived. The button represented the only record, however small, that a crime had been committed. Duncan Hayes never spoke to Catherine again about what he had done. But his action represented a crack in the machinery of the system, a moment where someone with power had acknowledged, however minimally, the humanity of someone without it. It was not redemption, not even kindness, but it was something. Between 1850 and 1851, 6 more children were born and subsequently disappeared. The network handling these transactions had become more efficient. The time between birth and disappearance had shortened to as little as 3 weeks. The white families receiving these children had grown more confident in the legal protections surrounding them. Falsified birth records had become easier to produce as more clerks and officials were brought into the conspiracy through payment or coercion. Robert Brennan had established relationships with 7 families across South Carolina and Georgia who were willing to pay between $800 and $1,500 for a child who could pass as white. The amounts were staggering. A skilled enslaved person might be sold for $1,200. But these transactions involved children who would not provide labor for years and required extensive legal manipulation to hide their origins. The high prices reflected both the risk involved and the desperation of wealthy white couples unable to have children through conventional means. Samuel Porter coordinated the logistics traveling between plantations, identifying potential candidates, arranging timing, and handling transportation. Dr. Horace Strickland provided medical documentation when needed, certifying that children were healthy, and more importantly, creating birth certificates and vaccination records that established false identities. By late 1851, 17 children had been processed through this network. They lived in homes across the South, attending schools, learning to read and write, growing up with all the privileges of whiteness that had been denied to their mothers. None of them knew where they had come from. The youngest, the 6 children born in 1850 and 1851, would grow up with no memory of anything before their adoptive families. The older ones, like Lily, now Sarah Brennan, 7 years old, and learning piano, had only the vaguest impressions of a time before. dreamlike fragments that grew hazier with each passing year. The secret was kept not just by the white families who had purchased these children, but by the enslaved mothers who had lost them. Speaking about what had happened was dangerous and pointless. There was no authority to appeal to, no law that would acknowledge their loss as a crime. Slavery had taken their children in the most thorough way imaginable, not through sale or death, but through erasure and transformation. The children had not died, but they were gone just as completely as if they had. For the enslaved women of the South Carolina Low Country, the pain of these disappearances was compounded by a terrible knowledge. Their children were alive, growing up somewhere, but living as white, raised by people who would never tell them the truth of where they came from. It was a grief with no resolution, a loss with no grave to visit, a wound that could not heal because it could not be acknowledged. But the network that had operated with such efficiency and secrecy was about to fracture, not because of exposure from outside, but because of betrayal from within. In March 1852, Duncan Hayes became ill. The sickness started as a persistent cough and fever, symptoms that he initially dismissed as a common respiratory ailment. But within 2 weeks, the cough had worsened, bringing up blood, and his fever spiked high enough that Thomas Colson sent for a doctor from Charleston. The diagnosis was consumption, tuberculosis, and the prognosis was grim. Hayes spent the next 3 months confined to his quarters, his body deteriorating steadily. Thomas Colson hired a temporary overseer to manage the plantation, a man named Walter Griffin, who had no knowledge of the child trafficking network and was kept deliberately uninformed. By June, it was clear that Hayes would not recover. He could barely speak above a whisper, and his weight had dropped to the point that his clothes hung loosely on his frame. In late June, Hayes asked to speak privately with Thomas Colson. When Thomas arrived at the quarters, he found Hayes sitting up in bed, his breathing labored. But his eyes alert Hayes gestured toward the loose floorboard where he had hidden his journal and told Thomas to retrieve it. Thomas read the journal that night in his study, working through Hayes's cramped handwriting by lamplight. What he found confirmed his worst fears. Hayes had documented every child's disappearance in detail, including dates, names of mothers, physical descriptions of children, and most damning, references to Samuel Porter, Robert Brennan, and Dr. Strickland. Hayes had also noted approximate amounts of money involved in several transactions based on overhead conversations. The journal was not a complete record of the network. Hayes had not witnessed all 17 transactions and had limited knowledge of the receiving families, but it contained enough specific information to be catastrophically dangerous. If it fell into the wrong hands, if an abolitionist newspaper got hold of it, if a federal investigator looking into illegal slave trading discovered it, the consequences would extend far beyond Thomas Colson. This was not just violation of moral codes that many white Southerners were willing to overlook. It was fraud, falsification of legal documents, and a conspiracy that implicated some of South Carolina's most prominent families. Thomas asked Hayes why he had kept such records. His voice, barely audible, told him that he had not decided whether to use the journal as insurance or leverage, only that he had wanted proof of something extraordinary. He had spent his life enforcing a brutal system and had thought himself beyond surprise. But the child trafficking had revealed new depths of what people would do when they had absolute power over others. He had wanted a record of that. He had wanted someone to know. Now facing death, Hayes offered Thomas a deal. Thomas could have the journal on one condition. He would deliver a sealed letter to Catherine, the mother whose son Joseph had been taken. Hayes would not tell Thomas what the letter contained, but he promised it would not threaten the network or expose the conspiracy. It was, he said, a personal matter. Thomas agreed, though he had no intention of honoring the promise. He took the journal and burned it that night, watching as the pages curled and blackened in his study fireplace. The smoke smelled acrid chemical from the ink, and he kept the windows closed, despite the heat, to ensure that no fragment of paper could escape and float where someone might find it. Duncan Hayes died 3 days later. On July 4, 1852, he was buried in a small cemetery on the plantation grounds, his grave marked with a simple stone that gave his name and dates. No service was held. Thomas Colson attended the burial, but spoke no words over the grave. The letter Hayes had written to Catherine remained sealed in Thomas's desk drawer for 2 weeks. He considered burning it as he had burned the journal, but curiosity prevented him. Finally, one evening, when the house was quiet, he broke the seal and read what Hayes had written. The letter contained an address in Columbia, 134 Westfield Avenue, and a name, Sarah Brennan. Below that, Hayes had written a single line, "Your daughter lives." The button I returned to you came from her clothing. Thomas read the letter 3 times, his stomach tightening with each pass. Hayes had somehow discovered where Lily had been placed. The information could only have come from Samuel Porter or Robert Brennan, which meant that the network had been compromised, that information had leaked or been sold. And Hayes, in his final act, had chosen to arm an enslaved mother with knowledge that could unravel everything. Thomas burned the letter as he had burned the journal, but he understood that destroying the paper did not eliminate the knowledge. Hayes might have told Catherine already. He might have told others. The information existed now in human memory where it could spread and replicate beyond control. Thomas considered his options carefully. He could have Catherine sold immediately, sending her far from South Carolina, dispersing the threat before it could materialize. But such an action would draw attention, would raise questions among the other enslaved people at Fair Hope, who would wonder why Catherine specifically had been targeted. It would also alert Samuel Porter and Robert Brennan that something had gone wrong, potentially triggering panic and rash decisions within the network. He decided instead to watch Catherine closely and wait for. If she made any move toward Columbia, if she tried to communicate with anyone beyond the plantation, he would act. Until then, he would maintain normal operations and hope that an enslaved woman's powerlessness would contain the threat. What Thomas did not know, what he could not have known, was that Catherine already possessed all the information in Hayes's letter. Hayes had spoken to her twice before his death, during moments when Thomas had been away from the plantation on business. He had told her where Lily had been taken, and more importantly, he had told her how the entire network operated, the plantations involved, the names of the white men coordinating the transactions, the approximate locations where other children had been placed. Hayes had shared this information for reasons he himself did not fully understand. Perhaps it was guilt finally asserting itself as death approached. Perhaps it was a desire to create chaos in a system he had spent his life enforcing. Perhaps it was simple spite against the wealthy men who had profited while he had taken risks for a modest salary. Whatever the motivation, Hayes had given Catherine something extraordinary: knowledge. Catherine did nothing with this knowledge immediately. She understood that any direct action would result in her death or sale. She could not travel to Columbia. She could not write letters. She could not approach authorities. The system that had taken her son had also ensured that she had no means of fighting back. But Catherine did something that would prove far more dangerous to the network than any immediate action. She told the other mothers. One by one, carefully and in absolute secrecy, she shared what Hayes had revealed. Irina learned that her daughter Lily lived in Columbia under the name Sarah Brennan. A woman named Hannah learned that her son lived in Charleston, renamed Michael Garrison. Another woman, Clara, learned that her daughter had been taken to Savannah, Georgia, and now went by Anna Whitfield. The mothers could not reclaim their children. They could not reveal the truth. But they possessed the knowledge, and they passed it to each other like precious contraband, creating a counter-archive to replace the journal that Thomas Colson had burned. Each woman memorized names and addresses. They repeated them silently, rehearsed them in their minds, ensured that the information would not be lost. This archive had no purpose beyond its own preservation. The mothers had no illusions about justice or reunion. But the knowledge itself became a form of resistance, proof that their children had existed, that crimes had been committed, that history would not be entirely controlled by those with the power to write official records. In August 1852, the network ceased operations. Samuel Porter sent word to the 5 plantation owners involved that all activities should be suspended indefinitely. Duncan Hayes's death had created uncertainty, and there were rumors, vague, unsubstantiated, that information had been leaked. The risk was too high to continue. The white families who had received children were instructed to maintain their stories and avoid any communication with the others. The conspiracy entered a phase of protective silence. Robert Brennan, perhaps feeling the weight of accumulated guilt, or perhaps simply recognizing the legal jeopardy he had placed himself in, made one final gesture. Through Samuel Porter, he sent a message to Thomas Colson and the other plantation owners. If any of the enslaved mothers involved were found attempting to communicate about the children, they should be sold immediately, but not harmed. The violence that had characterized so much of the institution of slavery should not extend to these particular women. Brennan argued, because brutality would only increase the chances of exposure if anyone bore witness and chose to speak. It was not mercy, but pragmatism, and it was ignored by at least one plantation owner who decided that risk management required more permanent solutions. In October 1852, a woman named Hannah disappeared from Elmwood Plantation near Georgetown. She had been one of the mothers Catherine had told about the network, and she had made the mistake of asking too many questions about travel passes and the roads to Charleston. The overseer reported her as a runaway, and a search party spent 3 days looking for her in the surrounding forests and swamps. She was never found. The other mothers understood what Hannah's disappearance meant. Someone had been watching. Someone knew that information had spread, and someone had decided to act. The fragile safety of silence was breaking down. Within the network of enslaved communities, word passed through the coded language of grief and warning. Say nothing, do nothing, do nothing. Forget what you know if you want to survive. Catherine, who had been the source of the information, understood that she was in immediate danger. But she had one advantage. Thomas Colson did not know with certainty what she knew or who she had told. His surveillance of her had revealed nothing incriminating because Catherine had been extraordinarily careful, sharing information only in whispered conversations during moments when no overseer or white person was within hearing. In November 1852, 3 months after the network's operations were suspended, Robert Brennan received a letter that made his blood cold. The letter had been delivered to his Columbia law office by a courier who provided no information about its origin. It was written in careful, educated handwriting on plain paper with no distinguishing marks. The letter read, "I know what you have done. I know the names of 17 children and the families that purchased them. I know the plantations where they were born and the names of their mothers. I will not expose this information at this time, but you should understand that it exists in multiple hands and will be released if any harm comes to certain people. You will receive further communication within 1 year. Expect nothing until then." The letter was unsigned and contained no specific demands, which made it more frightening than a straightforward blackmail attempt. Robert showed the letter to Samuel Porter, and together they tried to determine its source. Had Duncan Hayes shared his journal's contents with someone before his death? Had one of the enslaved mothers somehow learned to write and gained access to paper and postal delivery? An almost impossible scenario. Had someone outside the network discovered evidence and was now making preliminary threats? They had no answers, only escalating fear. Doctor, they are... Horace Strickland, when informed of the letter, insisted they should go to authorities and claim they were being targeted by abolitionist agitators attempting to frame them. But Robert recognized the fatal flaw in this approach. Any investigation would inevitably uncover the falsified documents Strickland himself had created. The birth certificates, vaccination records, and medical attestations that had made the children's transformations legally possible would not withstand scrutiny. Going to authorities meant risking exposure of the very crimes they wanted to hide. Just when we thought we'd seen it all, the conspiracy that had operated in such careful secrecy was now threatened from multiple angles. If this story is giving you chills, share this video with a friend who loves dark mysteries. Hit that like button to support our content, and don't forget to subscribe to never miss stories like this. Let's discover together what happens next. In January 1853, a second letter arrived. This time delivered to Samuel Porter's home in Charleston. The handwriting was different from the first letter, rougher, less educated, but the content was equally disturbing. 5 mothers know where their children are. If any of these women disappear or come to harm, the names will be published in every abolitionist newspaper from Boston to Philadelphia. You cannot kill information once it has been distributed. Cease all further actions against these women. This letter changed the dynamic completely. The author was not asking for money or making demands. They were establishing a mutual, assured destruction scenario. Any action against the mothers would trigger the network's exposure, which would destroy the white families involved and potentially lead to criminal prosecution. Samuel Porter realized something that Robert Brennan had not yet grasped. The blackmailer might themselves be enslaved, or might be working with enslaved people who had access to information but limited ability to act on it directly. The letters were protective rather than exploitative, suggesting that the author's primary goal was not personal gain, but preventing violence against specific individuals. But protection through threat was a fragile arrangement, and both sides understood that it could collapse at any moment. In February 1853, Thomas Colson made a decision that would prove catastrophic. Despite the warnings in the letters, despite Robert Brennan's advice to take no action against the mothers, Thomas decided that Catherine represented too great a risk. She knew too much, and as long as she remained at Fair Hope Plantation, she could potentially communicate with abolitionists or federal investigators. Thomas arranged for Catherine to be sold to a trader who specialized in what was euphemistically called the Southwestern Market. The cotton plantations of Mississippi and Louisiana, where conditions were notoriously harsh and life expectancy was short. He told the trader that Catherine was troublesome and needed to be sent far away where she could have no contact with her previous community. The sale was finalized on February 18, 1853. Catherine was removed from Fair Hope Plantation before dawn. Given no opportunity to say goodbye to anyone and taken to Charleston, where she was held with other enslaved people awaiting transport, she spent 6 days in a slave pen, a brick structure near the docks, where people were kept in crowded cells until ships or overland coffles could take them to their destinations. On the 7th day, Catherine disappeared from the slave pen. The traitor reported her as a runaway, but no serious effort was made to find her. Enslaved people who escaped from Charleston usually either hid in the city's small free black community or attempted to reach the North through the underground network of people willing to help. Few succeeded. Most were caught within days and returned. Catherine was never found. Whether she successfully escaped, died in the attempt, or met some other fate remains unknown. What happened next suggests that someone had been watching and that Catherine's forced sale and disappearance triggered the consequence that the letters had warned about. In March 1853, a package arrived at the office of the Pennsylvania Freeman, an abolitionist newspaper published in Philadelphia. The package contained a detailed written account of the child trafficking network, including names of the 5 plantation owners involved, the role played by Samuel Porter, Robert Brennan, and Dr. Horace Strickland, and partial information about several of the children who had been trafficked. The account was not complete. It did not include all 17 children or receiving families, but it contained enough specific, verifiable details to be credible. Dates of births, plantation locations, the names of 3 enslaved mothers, and 2 addresses where children had been placed. Sarah Brennan at 134 Westfield Avenue in Columbia, and Michael Garrison at 67 Church Street in Charleston. The newspaper's editor, a man named Oliver Johnson, recognized immediately that he was holding evidence of an extraordinary crime, but he also understood the dangers of publication. The account had come from an anonymous source with no verifiable credentials. The newspaper could be sued for leal if the accusations proved false or unprovable. And publishing such incendiary material in 1853, as tensions between North and South were escalating toward eventual war, could have consequences that extended far beyond one scandal. Johnson spent 2 weeks investigating the claims. He sent a correspondent to Columbia to verify whether a family named Brennan lived at 134 Westfield Avenue and whether they had a daughter. The correspondent confirmed both facts, but could not determine the child's true origins without raising suspicions. Johnson also consulted with lawyers about the legal implications of publishing the account. The lawyers advised that without testimony from the enslaved mothers, which would be impossible to obtain since enslaved people could not testify against white people in Southern courts, the account could not lead to prosecution. It would amount to an explosive accusation with no legal remedy. On April 2, 1853, Oliver Johnson made his decision. He wrote a reply to the anonymous source, addressing the letter to a friend of truth and placing a notice in several newspapers stating that such a letter had been deposited at a specific location in Philadelphia, explaining why he could not publish the full account out. The legal and practical obstacles were too severe. Publication would destroy the newspaper without achieving justice for the trafficked children. Instead, Johnson offered an alternative. He would publish a carefully worded editorial discussing the theoretical possibility of such crimes, raising public awareness about gaps in the legal system that could allow enslaved children to be trafficked and their identities erased. He would not name specific people or locations, but he would describe the mechanics of how such a network could operate. The editorial was published on April 15, 1853, under the headline, "The Invisible Crime: How Children of Enslaved Mothers Could Be Sold into White Society." It was carefully written to avoid leal, presenting the scenario as a hypothetical possibility rather than a factual report. The editorial generated some discussion in abolitionist circles, but was largely ignored by mainstream newspapers and had no practical impact on the families involved. For Robert Brennan, Samuel Porter, and the others involved in the network, The editorial was both a relief and a source of ongoing anxiety. They had escaped direct exposure, but the knowledge that detailed information about their actions existed somewhere beyond their control meant they could never feel entirely safe. The 17 children had been absorbed so completely into white society that tracing them became nearly impossible. Their descendants, numbering in the hundreds by the 1990s, lived throughout the United States, almost all of them unaware that their family trees contained a hidden branch that led back to the slave quarters of South Carolina plantations. One descendant, a woman named Patricia Hillman, did eventually learn the truth. In 2003, while researching her family history, she discovered irregularities in her great-great-grandmother's birth certificate, Sarah Brennan, born 1843. The certificate had been amended twice, and the original date had been altered. Patricia, who worked as a paralegal and understood document fraud when she saw it, began her own investigation. What she uncovered over the course of 3 years led her back to Dr. Morrison's research and eventually to Ruth's notebook. Patricia realized with a shock that her great-great-grandmother had been born into slavery as Lily, daughter of Raina, before being sold into white society at 6 months old. Patricia struggled with this knowledge. It challenged everything she understood about her family identity. It raised uncomfortable questions about complicity, about who had known what and when, about whether her ancestors had been victims or participants in a crime. She considered going public with her findings, but ultimately decided against it, fearing the social and professional consequences. She did, however, do one thing. She visited the site of Fairhope Plantation, which had been abandoned in the early 1900s and was now overgrown with kudzu and pine trees. She walked through what had been the quarters, finding only scattered tabby stones and broken fragments of pottery, and she stood where her great-great-grandmother Rie had once lived, trying to imagine what it had been like to lose a child in such a complete and irrevocable way. Patricia left a small bouquet of wildflowers at the site and drove back to Columbia. She never returned. The story of the 17 children represents a crime that was never prosecuted, a trauma that was never acknowledged, and a truth that remains largely unknown. The children who were trafficked lived their lives without knowing what had been done to them. The mothers who lost them died without justice or reunion. The white men who orchestrated the network were never held accountable, but the story did not disappear entirely. It survived in fragments, in Ruth's notebook, in gaps in plantation records, in falsified birth certificates that raised questions when examined carefully, and in the memories passed down through African American families who told stories of children who vanished and were never seen again. The legal and social structures that made such trafficking possible were specific to the institution of American slavery, but they reflected broader patterns of power, exploitation, and the eraser of inconvenient truths that have continued in different forms throughout history. The children were valuable because they could pass as white, because their appearance allowed them to cross a racial boundary that determined everything about a person's life in 19th century America. That boundary was maintained through violence, law, and custom. And the men who trafficked these children understood exactly how to exploit it for profit. The mothers who lost their children exercised what resistance they could. They remembered. They told each other what they knew, and they created an informal archive to counter the official silence. It was not enough to win justice or recover their children, but it was something. It was a refusal to let the crime be completely erased. Today, descendants of those 17 children live throughout the United States. Most will never know the truth about their ancestry. A few, like Patricia Hillman, may discover fragments of the story and have to decide what to do with that knowledge. The choice is complicated by the fact that the crime was committed generations ago by people long dead, and the victims and perpetrators exist, now only as names in historical records. But perhaps there is value in knowing, even when knowing changes nothing about the present. Perhaps understanding what happened, how thoroughly identity could be erased, how completely children could be stolen, not just from their mothers, but from their own histories, tells us something important about the mechanisms of power and the possibility of resistance, even in systems designed to make resistance impossible. The 17 children of the South Carolina Low Country were transformed into white Americans through fraud, force, and the exploitation of absolute power over enslaved people. Their mother's grief was silenced, but not eliminated. The story was buried, but not completely lost. And more than 170 years later, we are left with questions that have no satisfying answers. What does justice look like for crimes this old? How do we acknowledge trauma that has been deliberately forgotten? What do we owe to the people whose stories were erased from official history? This mystery shows us that the most thorough crimes are not the ones committed in darkness, but the ones committed in plain sight, protected by law and custom. Their evidence carefully destroyed, their victims denied, even the language to name what was done to them. What do you think of this story? Do you believe everything was revealed? Leave your comment below. If you enjoyed this tale and want more horror stories like this, subscribe to Circle of Fear, hit the notification bell, and share with someone who loves mysteries. See you in the next video.